What has happened, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back today to offer a review of Quentin Tarantino's latest book, Cinema Speculation, which is basically a collection of essays and reviews and rants about film history that more or less is concerned with like the late 60s through the early 80s when Quentin Tarantino was a young film goer. And any book that's got Sam Peckinpah on the cover automatically is going to work its way into my cold, dead heart because Sam Peckinpah is one of my all-time favorite filmmakers. He's on my Mount Rushmore of favorite directors. But the title, Cinema Speculation, seems to come from a handful of essays where he speculates on ideas like, what if Brian De Palma had directed Taxi Driver instead of Martin Scorsese? But most of the articles in this book, they at least ostensibly are about one particular movie, say Taxi Driver, but instead of just doing a review of Taxi Driver or recounting his experiences first wrestling with the movie, what I love about this book is how each chapter will give us kind of the historical context of where the directors were at the time when they made that particular movie and what came after. And so it's not really a collection of film reviews. It's more a collection of rants about the careers of Tobe Hooper or Brian De Palma or Paul Schrader or any of the other directors that are featured in this book. And what I find interesting is how Don Siegel is the only director in here who gets two massive entries. I mean, there's certain directors who come up a lot, and there are certain films which come up repeatedly, but Don Siegel, his films Dirty Harry as well as Escape from Alcatraz both get covered. And I've always loved Don Siegel, and I've always respected his films. But as I was reading this book, I came to realize I still got a couple of really good Don Siegel movies left to see, like Riot and Cell Block 11. So the highest praise I can give for this book is that after all these years, Quentin Tarantino can still get me really fired up to see a lot of movies that I've never seen before. Movies like The Outfit, which is kind of an unofficial sequel to John Borman's Point Blank, or at least it's another movie featuring those characters from that ongoing series of books, and it's from the same director who directed Rolling Thunder, and I fucking love Rolling Thunder. And throughout his career, going back to the 90s, Quentin Tarantino, while he's been entertaining me with his movies, he's one of those directors like Martin Scorsese or Peter Bogdanovich, where they've seen a hell of a lot of flicks, and through their recommendations, I've discovered some of my all-time favorite movies. And who knows, in the years to come, maybe his most enduring legacy will not be his feature films, but rather his preservation of film history. I mean, he owns the New Beverly Theater in LA now, where they only show 35 millimeter prints, which is a very rare special privilege for film freaks, because when you see a film projected on film, there's just a very tactile, physical experience or interaction you have with the film that you don't have when it's projected digitally. And if you've got a few scratches or cigarette burns or whatever the case might be, or occasional like reels out of order, that's part of the experience. My podcast, Wrong Reel, is named after an experience I had at the LA County Museum when they were showing the Marx Brothers film, A Day at the Races, and the reels were out of order, and they had to stop the movie and reassemble it and get it going again, which is obviously not fun at the time, but once again, it's part of just the misadventures of interacting with film as a medium. And I'm not going to claim that this book is necessarily like really rigorous, dense, kind of intellectual film criticism. It's much more autobiographical, because more often than not, when he's reviewing these movies, he'll walk us through his experiences of going to all these crazy double features and triple features all over LA, sometimes in the company of his parents, sometimes by riding buses like hours across town. And long before the days of VHS and Laserdisc and DVD and Blu-ray and all that stuff and cable, you had to really earn your knowledge of film history by hunting down obscure films at obscure revival houses. And if you didn't live in a city like LA or New York that had a lot of revival houses, you were kind of screwed. You basically have to wait sometimes for years to see certain obscure movies. And in one of the most moving chapters of the book, Quentin Tarantino describes how both his mother as well as her boyfriend were willing to take him along to movies as a young kid because he knew to keep his mouth shut, not to ask annoying questions. And I don't have any kids, so I don't really have a dog in this fight, but he brings up an interesting topic that's often brought up by Bret Easton Ellis, the author, where in the 70s, adults who were into New Hollywood and the movie brats and that sort of thing in the film school generation suddenly it was a very exciting time to see really adult, mature, controversial cinema in the theater. And if you didn't feel like paying for a babysitter, yeah, you would just drag your kids along. And the kids did not get a vote. And it didn't even really matter if the kids liked it or disliked it. They were coming along for the ride. And even if you were unable to fully appreciate a movie like Carnal Knowledge, it enriches your palate. It educated young filmgoers. And I don't think it's any coincidence that both Bret Easton Ellis and Quentin Tarantino both grew up to have just an absolute obsession with movies because they got exposed to really cool stuff as a kid. And so I feel like a lot of parents these days, my siblings included, who have a lot of kids, I've got 10 nieces and nephews, oftentimes they let kids dictate the conversation. Like, well, what do we want to watch tonight? And they're like, oh, let's watch, anyway, pick your poison when it comes to your latest Pixar vomit extravaganza and that sort of thing. And I don't think you're doing your kids any favors if your goal is to raise the next generation of great moviegoers. But I think most parents just want their kids to shut the fuck up, and they're not that concerned with kind of enriching their appreciation of film history. But getting back to QT, what the most interesting parts of this book for me are just the way he's able to recreate the moviegoing experience in the 1970s, where suddenly uncompromising, oftentimes like really aggressive, singular filmmakers were completely changing the medium as we knew it. And I really like how this book draws a distinction between the new Hollywood and the movie brats. And it's very easy for I guess, film connoisseurs and film historians to look at all the filmmakers from the late 60s and early 70s and kind of stir them all together. But I found this book really interesting in the way that it kind of drew a clear distinction between filmmakers like Robert Altman and Sam Peckinpah and Mike Nichols, and basically directors who during their formative years, they were not watching TV because TV wasn't really around yet, and they didn't fetishize old movies the same way that people like Martin Scorsese did, or that Steven Spielberg did, or that John Milius did, people who were raised on movies. And it's interesting how a lot of these directors from the late 60s, early 70s, they kind of faded right at the time where the movie brats really were taking over, when people like George Lucas and Brian De Palma would get together and hold casting sessions for Carrie and Star Wars at the same time. The way they were all kind of helping each other and collaborating, and how Brian De Palma saw the script for Taxi Driver, thought it wasn't commercial enough, but thought that Martin Scorsese would be ideal for it. That's really interesting, just seeing how it was a scene. It was almost like a group of really cool kids where like someone like Brian De Palma could invite Steven Spielberg to visit the set of Scarface, and Spielberg would end up directing a particular scene. And that's quite different from these directors in the late 60s, early 70s who were responding more to European and Japanese art house cinema, the late 50s, early 60s. And yeah, it's very obvious when a director is trying to recreate the experience of a great French New Wave film versus a director who's trying to make great genre films. And that's another thing this book calls attention to, is how the movie brats like Lucas and Spielberg were trying to make the best genre films ever made, as opposed to someone like Robert Altman when they made McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which is one of the best Westerns ever made, but they were deconstructionist Westerns. They're like all the genre films of the early 70s were kind of breaking down and reinventing these genres, whereas the movie brats a few years later were kind of putting them back together very successfully. But getting back to this book, it's fascinating to me that Quentin Tarantino has now written 2 books in tiers. We got this bad boy, and we got the novelization of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which is not even really a novelization of that movie because it's telling all the stories and chapters in between the scenes of the movie that we did not get in the movie. You get them in the book. And Tarantino's been threatening for years that in his twilight years, he would kind of drift away from filmmaking into film writing and just narrative writing and that sort of thing. And over the last 2 years, he's had 2 books, as well as the launching of his podcast. I think it's called Video Archives, or basically his podcast with Roger Avery is a love song to all the movies they watched when they were working at that Video Archives video store in Manhattan Beach. And so strangely, even though he's not necessarily making feature films anymore, he remains incredibly prolific in the world of film commentary, film appreciation. And I guess the question for me is going to be whether or not that translates to people in their teens and 20s falling in love with that commentary when they don't have the knowledge of the 60s and 70s that he does, like, is this book going to be completely impenetrable with all the references? Because every single page is just constant references to obscure TV shows, obscure films, obscure directors, and that sort of thing. And for me, when I read a book like that, I just start writing down names and I start writing down directors and I start, getting excited about all these things that I've never seen before. I mean, I've had Freebie and the Bean on my to-do list for many, many years, but it was a nice reminder that I still need to see that. Or weird, like, sex comedies like The Owl and the Pussycat, which I'd never heard of. But this is the way that I've always been when it comes to film history. Like, one of my big books back in college that I love was called Who the Devil Made It by Peter Bogdanovich. And it was just interviews with all these directors like Joseph von Sternberg and Howard Hawks and Otto Preminger. And what I loved about it was how not only did the book give us all these amazing insights to all these incredible directors, but it also gave us insights into the movies that they were watching, stuff that they were inspired by. I'm always looking for these kind of domino effects and chain reactions where you like a director, you hear what they like, what they were inspired by. You then go out and watch their movies, which leads to yet another domino effect and yet another chain reaction. And for a diehard film freak or film historian or film appreciator, whatever you want to call them, or cinephile, you're always looking for fresh sources of inspiration that'll lead you to undiscovered films, undiscovered bodies of work. And I feel like this book, because it's constantly referencing people like Peter Bogdanovich and what inspired them, et cetera, and so forth, it could keep you busy for years hunting down all these obscure gems. But whether or not people in their teens and 20s will respond the same way, I have no idea. This has just been the way that I've operated as a film freak over the last 25 years. But what's interesting about this book and its appreciation of film history and the way I've approached film history, Quentin Tarantino is basically celebrating the films from his formative years. He was born in the early 60s, so these are the movies that he saw as a kid and as a teenager during one of the, like a second golden age of Hollywood. I mean, the 70s for me is my favorite decade of filmmaking. It was a very easy time to be a young film freak, so he's basically kind of recapturing that era. But for me, my favorite directors and my favorite movies all come from a time before I was born. And there are plenty of films that have come out during my lifetime that I love and adore, but I have a different kind of reverence for the filmmakers that came before. Like, that is like history, as opposed to the films that came out during my life that's like real life. And that's a weird arbitrary distinction, but I just look at the films before 1976 in a completely different light than I do from 1976 onward. So my reverence for film history is very different from the way Quentin Tarantino reveres film history, where he really reveres the people that were the heroes of his childhood. But I think no matter how you approach film history, no matter how you look at film history, this book will make you crave the opportunity to see more films by directors of uncompromising vision. And what the book really calls attention to is how there are different eras where directors of uncompromising vision go in and out of fashion. There are some periods like the 80s where those directors are few and far between, where it was almost an era of self-censorship compared to the 70s, where it was the exception, not the norm, to find a director like Paul Verhoeven or Pedro Almodovar or David Lynch or David Cronenberg or Abel Ferrara or Brian De Palma when he was making his best stuff. Brian De Palma made plenty of turkeys, but he also made many, many brilliant movies. But it'll just make you appreciate how rare and special it is when a period like the early 70s comes along, where suddenly the whole industry is seeking out films of an uncompromising nature, almost to the point where it becomes a cliche that every movie is about somebody wrestling with their problems, where a movie has a really depressing ending. Like, that shit gets old. And one of the reasons that movies like Star Wars and Jaws and Rocky were so popular when they finally came along is that audience had become so, I guess, trained to watch movies that were depressing and downbeat, that suddenly when they got upbeat, happy endings, they were like, fuck yeah, like, this is great. And this book definitely captures that transition point, like the mid-late 70s, where audiences started craving, like, feeling great at the movies again. But as Tarantino explores these movies from the early 70s, it really makes you appreciate an era where complex characters and nuanced characters there's a greater value placed on those types of characters than with characters being sympathetic. And I think right now we're living in an era where we're overemphasizing characters being likable and sympathetic. And we do need to see a return of complex characters who are anti-heroes or unlikable or just downright sons of bitches. And sometimes you just want to see a movie about somebody who's fucking evil or morally dubious. And that's one of the real highlights of films from the early 70s, where just being a bad motherfucker was much more important than being a wholesome, likable individual. And sprinkled throughout this book are excerpts of interviews that he's had with a lot of the directors who made these movies. Like, he interviewed friggin' Paul Schrader about his film Hardcore, and he told Schrader in advance that he had a lot of problems with the second half of Hardcore. And Paul Schrader very frankly told him that he has a lot of problems with the second half of Hardcore as well. Or all the insights provided by Walter Hill. And there's this great line at one point where Walter Hill says, "Boy, Quentin, you're really moving the boulder away from the mouth of the cave to see where all the bodies are buried." I mean, that's the highest form of praise, where one filmmaker acknowledges that another filmmaker is really getting to the root of how the creative decisions were made on a movie like The Getaway, where you've got Walter Hill and Steve McQueen and Sam Peckinpah and author Jim Thompson, all these different strong, powerful figures pulling the movie in different directions, and how we eventually got the movie that we got. And The Getaway is an absolutely fantastic movie, and it was, I think, Sam Peckinpah's biggest commercial success, or one of. And as much as Quentin Tarantino loves the movie, and as many times as he's seen it, he does draw some really interesting distinctions between the source material and the final product of the movie. And Quentin will occasionally take a break from ranting and raving about movies that he loves to celebrate great film commentators who perhaps haven't received the credit that they're due, in particular, Kevin Thomas. For many, many years at the Los Angeles Times, Kevin Thomas was kind of like the second-rate or third-rate, or basically second-tier or third-tier film critic who would be sent out to watch all the grindhouse movies, exploitation movies, drive-in movies, etc., and so forth. And while at the time a lot of film snobs were looking down on those movies, what they were overlooking was how in the 70s, a lot of future luminaries like Jonathan Demme were sharpening their teeth and practicing their craft, making those kinds of movies. And so while they might have frowned upon his earlier movies, you don't get the Jonathan Demme who would eventually make Silence of the Lambs if he didn't get all that practice in the grindhouse scene in the 70s. But as a result, Kevin Thomas helped the industry discover a lot of these directors, because if you're an executive or a producer or whatever, and you're flipping through the Los Angeles Times to read the reviews of the latest films, and you're looking for inexpensive up-and-coming directors, and you see a positive review of some women in prison movie, well, that's how directors like Jonathan Demme were able to kind of climb the studio hierarchy. But also Kevin Thomas was just an early champion of a lot of kind of unsavory, like sexploitation films that still are frowned upon by a lot of other people, but that I find amazing. Like Russ Meyer is one of my all-time favorite directors, and one of his best movies, maybe my favorite movie by him, is Super Vixens. And Kevin Thomas wrote at great length about all the positive attributes of that wildly unconventional film. And it's just refreshing to see that a movie that I feel like still has not gotten its due over the last 50 years, well, there in 1975 was Kevin Thomas singing its praises, banging the drum on the movie's behalf. But as far as my criticisms of the book go, there's a very real risk that the book has absolutely no cultural relevance to anyone who is preoccupied with cinema beyond the year like 1981. Like, he doesn't even use examples from the book to kind of call attention to problems of the present day. And I think he very deliberately is avoiding discussing contemporary cinema because he doesn't want to be called out for like kind of ragging on or picking on his peers. And I get that, but I would love to see a book like this by Tarantino that just covers the last 10 years of cinema. And if he just wanted to make it nothing but an examination of all the problems that the industry is suffering from, but that would give you a sense of urgency to read the book. There are times where film historians get so preoccupied with the past that they kind of retreat up their own ass, and they forget that you need to find a way to connect all this to the present day. Or I guess you don't have to, but it creates more of a sense of urgency to need to read the stuff or wrestle with it, because otherwise it just becomes like esoterica. Like, I'm sure 19th century French poetry is absolutely riveting to the buffs out there, but there's no real like deliberate or urgent need to read it because it's not like connected to anything we're experiencing in 2022, or at least not to my knowledge. But because the 70s is already my favorite decade of filmmaking, well, for me, this was just like eating nothing but chocolate. I mean, I ripped through the entire book in one day, and it's not a particularly long book, and like I said, it's very readable, but I was the perfect target audience for this. I can't say that everybody else is going to necessarily have the same experience unless they're older. Like I'm sure for my dad, who was born in 1950, this would be a ton of fun because he would just get to relive all of his favorite movies from college and as a young man. But if I had to call attention to some of my favorite passages from this book, the essay on Dirty Harry is particularly good in terms of where Clint Eastwood and Don Siegel were in their careers at that time and what that film meant and how it wrestled with the politics of that era and how a lot of movies would kind of pretend to be Dirty Harry afterwards, but were not really willing or fearless enough to go all the way. And what's interesting about this book is how it dispels a lot of the myths that I cling to about this being an era of like unbridled freedom for all these controversial filmmakers, because if you look at Paul Schrader's experiences with the rewrites of Rolling Thunder, well, it will dispel any romanticized notions you have of the unbridled freedom of the 1970s, because at the time that he wrote it, Rolling Thunder was considered to be an unfilmable screenplay. And while the final product is an amazing movie, Quentin does an amazing job of articulating what was so shocking about the first draft, what was changed, why the final film still works, but how ultimately Paul Schrader's nightmarish apocalyptic vision for that original story was totally abandoned, even though the final product ended up being a really good fucking movie. But another highlight of this book is the chapter on Brian De Palma's sisters. Brian De Palma is one of the key influences on Tarantino, but Tarantino can be really harsh on him when his films disappoint, and he's more than happy to call attention to the flaws in his films, even the films that he loves, like Sisters. So that was a real highlight. Another interesting thing is how almost every single chapter in this book brings up John Ford's The Searchers, a film which I think is one of the best Westerns ever made. I did a giant episode of it, an episode of my podcast, Wrong Reel, devoted to it with film historian David Lambert. But I've always been under the impression that Quentin Tarantino hates John Ford and hates The Searchers and hates basically, for someone who loves Westerns as much as Tarantino does, he always has negative things to say about John Ford. But because people like Martin Scorsese were so heavily influenced by The Searchers, it's impossible for Tarantino to wrestle with the film school generation without also wrestling with the films that they loved. And so, for whatever reason, almost every single film review in this book finds a way to go back to John Ford's The Searchers and what that film is doing and how so many of these movies owe a huge debt to it. So it was interesting how maybe in his old age, Tarantino is finally coming around on The Searchers, but John Ford fans will be delighted by how often that movie comes up in this book. But in closing, I'll just say it is such a relief to read a book of film commentary, film history, film reviews, where the person writing it clearly loves cinema. And I feel like that's something that's often missing from today's critics where, and this is not a new phenomenon because Tarantino says this was a big problem in the 70s as well, where you've got a lot of people writing reviews who hate movies, hate their job, and hate their lives, and it's obvious. I mean, go to Rotten Tomatoes and pick any movie that you love and read a couple of reviews. You're like, oh my God, like all these critics, like no one would want to spend time in their company. You want to hang out with the filmmakers and the actors and that sort of thing. But a lot of film critics, I think oftentimes are just intensely unlikable people, which makes a film critic like Kevin Thomas all the more refreshing because Kevin Thomas clearly loved his job, loved his vocation, loved the films that he was seeing. And even when people disagreed with him, his personality was so warm and so engaging, people wanted to read his reviews, even when they completely, totally disagreed with what he said. And the same holds true with Quentin Tarantino. Tarantino can be very unlikable, but his enthusiasm is so warm and so sincere, I will gladly read his rants any day of the week. Same with Scorsese, same with Peter Bogdanovich, same with Jean-Luc Godard. I mean, all the filmmakers who started out as film freaks and then became filmmakers, or Francois Truffaut, those are the people where I respond to their rants the most because it all comes from a place of love and admiration, where they just love the kind of visceral, decadent, aesthetic thrill where images and sounds collide together to give you this out-of-body, otherworldly aesthetic experience. And in the end, for me, watching movies is about like a decadent physical thrill and pleasure you feel when a great movie-going experience washes over you. But I feel like a great movie-going experience at its best should be like going to a great concert or like a great sexual experience or like a great meal, something where you just feel tons of pleasure that you can't even necessarily put into words. I think that's something that's missing sometimes with a lot of film commentary, is that decadent, bohemian, almost a hedonistic lust for pleasure and thrills. And no matter what you might think of Tarantino's movies or his personality, there's no denying that this is a book of pure, unbridled love, affection, and expertise about film history. So I strongly recommend anybody interested in film history, movies from the 70s, or Quentin Tarantino, definitely pick it up and check it out. Because for me, a true film freak, part of you always has to remain a perpetual student. And I remember Martin Scorsese calling attention to that years ago with his documentary, brilliant documentary, Personal Journey Through American Filmmaking with Martin Scorsese, which also had an accompanying book, which plays a very similar role to this book, where a personal journey calls attention to all the films from the 30s, 40s, and 50s that really helped make Scorsese into the filmmaker he became. Same holds true with this, but I remember Scorsese calling attention to the fact that if you want to continue to hone your craft and enrich your palate and like deepen your appreciation, you always have to be in the process of discovering and evolving. And I've got at least like 50 or 60 movies that I want to see because of this book. So thank you, Quentin Tarantino, for writing this, and thank you for guiding me to so many amazing movies in the past and all the amazing movies that I will continue to discover in the future due to his enthusiasm. But before I wrap up this video, I do have to bring you a message from Manscaped, the official sponsor of my podcast, Wrong Reel. And if you love film history, definitely check out my podcast, Wrong Reel. But this holiday season, I'll be giving thanks to our friends over at Manscaped. Everyone loves turkey and stuffing, but you'll be looking like dessert with the help of Manscaped's Performance Package 4.0. The leaders in below-the-waist grooming have blessed you with the ultimate Thanksgiving dinner topic. Tell your in-laws about your new cutting-edge ball trimmer and gift yourself or the man in your life the ultimate men's hygiene bundle. Trim your pumpkins by going to manscaped.com and using the discount code WRONGREEL in all caps for free shipping and 20% off. Inside, you'll find their Lawnmower 4.0 trimmer, Weed Whacker ear and nose hair trimmer, Crop Preserver ball deodorant, Crop Reviver toner. Actually, the toner goes on first, the deodorant goes on second. Performance boxer briefs, and a travel bag to hold your goodies. Think of it as a cornucopia for your balls. So if you like my podcast, or you like my channel, that is a great way to support all my endeavors. But I can't thank you enough for listening to my lengthy review of this book. Definitely consider getting it for yourself or a loved one for Christmas. But if you like this video, subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, like the video, all that good stuff, and help me down on Twitter at Geeking Out if you want to talk about it more. But thanks again for listening. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.